Just a warning. This episode contains topics that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak.
I think it's safe to say that true crime documentaries and filmmaking have truly taken the world by storm. These stories dominate our screens and conversations, leaving us eager for the next jaw-dropping twist. While we're captivated by the tales of mystery and intrigue, how often do we stop to think about the people behind the camera? The filmmakers, the masterminds who painstakingly research, craft, and present these compelling narratives often remain in the shadows, even as their work sparks global discussions and stirs our deepest curiosities. Our guest today, documentary filmmaker Josh Zeman, has redefined the true crime genre through his compelling storytelling and investigative prowess.
Josh's groundbreaking documentaries include Cropsey, which investigates an urban legend and real-life horror, and The Killing Season, an in-depth look into the terrifying world of unsolved murders, sex work across the country, and the dark corners of online sleuthing. His work not only brings these chilling stories to light, but also raises awareness about the victims and their families. In this episode, Josh shares his journey as a filmmaker, the behind-the-scenes challenges of bringing true crime stories to the screen, and the impact his work has had on audiences and investigations.
Hello? How can I help you? Donation for my time would be $2 for the hour, $100 for the half. Half an hour would be fine. Just call me when you're getting off the exit.
Tell me about Long Island.
It's crazy. There's crazy people out here. There's a lot of freaks out here. There's a lot of naughty men.
What about those girls getting killed on Gilgo Beach?
It scared me. It scared me because it could happen. I mean, it could happen to me.
Hey Josh, how are you?
Good. How are you guys?
Pretty good. Obviously, you're a documentary filmmaker. You've done works such as Killer Legends, Cropsey, The Killing Season. Can you tell us about yourself?
I started kind of very young in the game from Staten Island, New York. Went to college, like a business college, and I didn't really like business. Ended up going into journalism, and then every summer I would go out to LA at the time. I would pick up a Hollywood Reporter and try and work on movie sets. Kind of go walk into the production company and be like, "Hey, do you need an intern? I'm here." And they said yes, and I started interning on movies. I did that for one summer, interned, and then got a job being a PA. And then I just kind of worked my way up through set life. PA, second AD, or second AD, first AD, production coordinator, production manager. I was moving into producing. I was going to do my first narrative feature, and then suddenly I couldn't find the money to do my first feature, a narrative feature. I was going to make Cropsey as a narrative feature, and then I was walking through the woods one day on a hike in the area that Cropsey is, this abandoned mental institution, and I saw the institution, and I saw these trays on the ground that were still there from the existing mental institution. And then I saw this abandoned playground and a doll in the leaves. And I was like, wait a second, we don't need to make it fiction. We could make it real. It's all right here in the woods. So we decided to turn that narrative film into a documentary. Then the documentaries just started coming in.
Growing up on Staten Island, Barbara and I had often heard the legend of Cropsey. For the kids in our neighborhood, Cropsey was the escaped mental patient who lived in the tunnels beneath the old abandoned Willowbrook Mental Institution, who would come out late at night, snatch children off the streets, Although we didn't know each other as children, Barbara and I had both shared versions of the Cropsey legend as it filtered through our separate neighborhoods and seeped into our collective fears.
A lot of your work involves true crime, urban legends, and kind of that sort of border edge of horror and all things dark. What fuels your interest in those topics?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I like the dark. My dad was the treasurer of Mystery Writers of America, so I kind of grew up with a lot of mystery books around the house and kind of meeting a lot of mystery or horror people. Like I met Stephen King when I was like 8 years old. Like it was huge for me. And my mom used to read all Stephen King, so I would read that stuff very early, and it was just so interesting and exciting. But they were doing fiction. And I think at the time, we as kind of the audience, if you will, the collective consciousness was like moving towards like, okay, fiction is cool, but if it's real, that's even more interesting. There's something really, I don't know, visceral, almost stranger than fiction, truth is stranger than fiction about it. So I think we were all moving as a collective audience towards there, Blair Witch. We know the fiction is exciting in a jump scare way, but we also know that the truth is somehow in the gut of your stomach even more interesting. So that's the kind of horror with the reality part of it. And then I've always just been interested in mythology, folklore. I like horror films, but I think that there's also even more reverence we can give these stories in some way.
The only witness today was Elsie Castro. She lived across the street from where Holly Ann lives. She says on her side of the street, but one house up, there's a green Volkswagen. She doesn't see anybody in the green Volkswagen. She goes into the house, she goes to take a shower and discovers that there's no soap.
Larry interviewed Elsie Castro. She saw nothing. But she claims she bought a bar of soap at the store and was 5 cents short.
It's very coincidental that she was a nickel short when Holly Ann was reportedly a nickel short as well, all within the time span of about an hour.
When you've heard 8 million summer camp stories, they kind of lose it after a while, at least in that generation. The next generation will come in and make their own version of that summer camp story. But for me, it's like, okay, why do we keep telling that same story? Why does that horror film keep coming up over and over? Why so many haunted house films and books and, like all these intrinsic subjects? What is it about that subject that creates that narrative that runs through all these stories that we just can't quit? So that's what I want to know. I want to get to that kernel of truth and kernel of our deepest fears, I guess.
Before the Verrazano Bridge was built, that's all it was. It was just this island, this forgotten island. All the children of Brooklyn, wanted their own home, and everybody wants land. You have a dog, you let him out in the backyard, just like, Father knows best.
It could be pretty quiet. I mean, even though Manhattan's right across the water, it's definitely a different life out here. If you travel around sometimes, people would say, oh, all right, that's where the largest garbage dump was. And, rumor has it you could see from outer space. So, one big garbage dump.
It was the least populated, most heavily wooded borough. From what I understand, this is a big dumping ground for mob bodies. Someone needs to be disposed of. It's like, let's bring them to Staten Island.
How do you come up and realize, okay, I need to investigate this. I need to make a movie about this theme or topic, because you have a wide variety of documentaries, which is great.
Yeah. Sometimes when you do such dark things, you kind of need to have a little bit of a palate cleanser. I had done The Killing Season, which was 8 episodes about sex workers in Long Island. And this was before they had caught the Long Island serial killer. We knew that there was somebody out there killing women. And we used that idea to kind of look at basically the changing face of sex work across the country, especially in the face of the opioid epidemic and the internet. All these things converge to create a different type of sex worker and a different take on the theoretical Jack the Ripper story, if you will. That was wicked dark. I went to, all the hot spots: Albuquerque, Atlantic City, Oklahoma City, Daytona. walking around in 3 a.m. talking to sex workers, knowing that many of these people have been drug-addled and the chances of them being around in 6 months were not likely. And so then I was like, oh God, that was really rough. And so then I did a movie called The Loneliest Whale, about the search for a whale, a singular whale that calls out a frequency that no other whale can understand. And so, you just kind of keep it light. You go back and forth. There's a thing in the industry where, just in general, I guess, we're always like, I'll do one for me and one for them, then being the man to make the money. So I serve my two sides, which is I'll do one on the dark and one on the light, and one on the dark and one on the light, just trying to keep a balance. The common theme, I guess, is a little bit of mystery. Who killed the sex workers in Long Island? Why hasn't then that case been solved? Or the mystery of this theoretical whale that's calling out and, never receives a response. They're all mysteries. I've been finding out as I go that sometimes the mysteries of nature are even more interesting in a way than mysteries of horror and crime. Don't get me wrong. I love horror and crime, but sometimes it's a deeper mystery in nature. And I have to say that the true crime world becomes far less exciting when everybody is out there trying to do their own true crime story. And unfortunately, not everybody's going to do it well. It's just the law of averages. And so as a result, just the whole genre gets brought down a couple notches. It's much harder for an individual to do something elevated and then it feel elevated just because there's so much content out there. When I was doing Cropsey, people were like, true crime, what the hell's that? Or they were like, horror documentary, you can't do that. That's never been done before. Horror and real. So when we were making, starting many years ago, actually, because Cropsey was 2010, you could make something and it felt original and fresh. And there weren't so many comparisons. And now it just seems on the true crime side, it's just a race to tell this story and to tell it differently rather than to really just discover and explore something. So maybe that's another reason I have been veering away for a while. It'll come back, but just we've reached peak true crime.
What kind of goes into making a documentary or a docuseries, and how are they different?
Well, the biggest difference is series, which means typically for a streamer or for somebody means that you have to bring everybody back episode to episode. That's their biggest question. How do you bring people from episode 1 to episode 2? Because theoretically, they are either binging. So binging is less harder, right? Because you're just, by definition, inertia, you're just leaving the TV on and just sitting there. But the question is, if it's 1 a.m., will they watch the next episode at 2 a.m. or will they go to bed? That's really your major question. Or even worse, are they going to watch the next episode when it comes out a week later? That is the main goal. You actually end up structuring the project, structuring the storytelling much differently to lean into those cliffhangers, if you will. Typically, it should all kind of be the same, but you're definitely changing around the structure so that the cliffhangers become, oh my gosh, moments. What's going to happen next? Versus theoretically of a documentary, a one-off, people are sitting down for that one storytelling. It's a captive audience. So you're going to unspool the story in a slightly different way.
Because I feel like streaming has definitely changed the way we watch things. Obviously, binge watching. Me watching The Killing Season, I did not want to stop watching it, so I didn't move.
You didn't move,
but
no inertia. You just. Yeah.
I mean, I paused for a couple minutes to go get a snack.
Excellent.
But in reality, I found it so compelling that I didn't want to stop, and I was kind of upset that it was over. Watching things has changed over the years. Obviously, Now you can just keep going, as opposed to, like you said, those cliffhangers where you have to wait for a whole entire week. Which I think shows like that in the past have also made me lose interest because things happen, you forget about them. So,
yeah, I have to admit, it's hard for me because I can't really commit 8 hours to a show or something, or good luck getting me to come back with a certain schedule. So yeah, the storytelling has changed, and sometimes not for the better. Now the big thing we all contend with is somebody going to turn around and say, well, they stayed at that party too late. The whole thing is, arrive late, leave early. And so everybody just comes constantly saying, oh, that could have been 4. It didn't need to be 6. That could have been 4 episodes. That didn't need to be 4 episodes. That could have been 3. So unfortunately, it makes us far less disciplined storytellers because we find ourselves having to fill space rather than have to make decisions about storytelling, about being economical storytellers. There's general public. Why didn't you put that in? Why didn't you put that in? It's definitely changed both the way we watch and the way we make them.
Was Andre Rand convicted on fact or fiction? We'll probably never know. But for the residents of Staten Island, there was no distinction. He was their child murderer, their scapegoat, and their boogeyman, all tightly woven into one.
You know, your two movies, Killer Legends and Cropsey, kind of explored events, true events that spun into a story that was larger than itself. And how did you see the same pattern or notice the same things when you were investigating the Gilgo Beach murders?
I'm always trying to take the story and look at what the societal message is behind that story, because that's one of the most interesting things about urban legends, and not true crime necessarily, but I mean, some people don't seem to understand this. Like, crime for crime's sake is not interesting. Murder for murder is not interesting, other than the fact that it's the oldest story in the book. There has to be, the crime itself has to speak to a larger societal story for us to really, in my mind, the crime should speak to a larger societal story so that the crime has a much more broader context and what we can learn from it. So Cropsey was about mentally ill. It was about boogeymen in your community. It was about all these things. Social justice, of course, social justice. Now, it doesn't have to always be social justice, but many times it should be. So that's the first and foremost, is there's a crime, but there has to be more layers to that crime in my mind. Well, with Cropsey, it was about the stories we tell ourselves in a community. Who lives in the abandoned lot coming home from school? Is that boogeyman going to snatch you or not? And it was just so interesting because here was a crime that connected with a childhood urban legend. And what we found out is that a lot of these urban legends actually do have some form of truth behind them. And then that truth gets twisted, and then whoever picks up that unsolved crime, because it usually has to be like an unsolved crime or a sighting that people can't explain, and then people will take the unexplained part of it and fashion it for their own.
Because urban legends, as scary as they may be, are really just warnings for something much more dangerous. The reality that may have started it all. The Hook is one of the oldest and also one of the scariest urban legends. A teenage couple are making out in their car while parked at a lover's lane. As the two are about to go all the way, the radio interrupts them. A crazed maniac with a hook for a hand has escaped from the local insane asylum. The frightened girl demands to go home as the frustrated boy guns the engine. Later, as the boyfriend goes to open his date's door, he sees dangling from the door handle the maniac's bloody hook, ripped from its socket.
The Hook urban legend probably came to be in the mid-1950s.
For example, back in the day, Jersey Devil. What is Jersey Devil really about? Well, there's a reason it's the devil. It's basically a bunch of zealots. I think they were like Quaker zealots or some kind of like zealots were basically being like, don't go in the woods. There's a bunch of heathens that live in the woods. So people would go missing in those woods because it was a swamp and it was really quite treacherous. And it just happened to be a very treacherous swamp. And so what would happen is, they would basically use the missing people or what have you to create a story about it to basically inform people, don't go in the swamp, there's devils in the swamp. Obviously it's a lot of devil stuff. So interestingly enough, who creates these urban legends? Well, they're cautionary tales, but they're very controlling. They're weirdly enough priests. It's like one of those, like, you're always shocked. You're like, that person's creating that narrative story? That priest or that mom? You always think it's like kids, right? Spreading lies and spreading rumors. And then you realize like it's an adult and you're like, wait, that's so weird. Like, why would they do that? That was how it worked for us. We made Cropsey, we started showing it around and people were like, oh, I have an urban legend in my hometown. And then we're like, okay, well, let's look at other urban legends in other hometowns and see if there's some kind of truth to them. Like the babysitter urban legend, like so many urban legends about babysitters, right? Scream, whether it's Scream or Halloween or whatever. And so we're like, okay, well, there's gotta be some good babysitter stories, but there really weren't. Not many cases of babysitters being killed. Interestingly enough, you would think there would be more. There's more cases of babysitters killing babies
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, there's more. It was a very popular urban legend, by the way, in the 1970s about like first time parents were going away and they're going out to dinner. Well, finally, their baby's like 6 months old and they hire the local hippie to take care of the child. And the mother keeps calling in. And finally, she calls in like after dessert and the hippie babysitter's like, yeah, the turkey's in the oven. And they're like, what turkey? You know, basically, it's an anti-LSD drug urban legend. Don't take drugs because, you'll put the baby in the oven.
That's interesting.
When I think babysitter, I think about me babysitting as a teenager and how fearful I was, being in a strange house, hearing strange sounds, not being familiar. But what's interesting is that I started researching babysitters thinking that I wouldn't have a hard time finding a case of a babysitter befalling some kind of death or kidnapping, the children upstairs being killed or whatever. It's very difficult to find any true crime to connect this urban legend with.
You would think with the amount of babysitters getting killed in popular culture that we would have just got a case immediately.
Well, it took me to going back to the 50s to actually find one.
We found this case of Jeanette Chrisman here in Columbia, Missouri, which is why we're here.
It's like a show that you may or may not have watched when you were younger, but on Nickelodeon they had Are You Afraid of the Dark? And it just reminds me of this one episode where the parents went out and there's a babysitter and she kind of, obviously it's a kid's show, so they're showing it in like a friendly way, but she kind of like traumatized the kid, and then like by the time the parents came back, he's like the perfect angel. It was just, I don't know why, it just reminded me of that.
Weirdly enough, the babysitter thing is really devious in terms of its messaging. Did you check the children? When a stranger calls, right? What is that really about? Basically, in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, it was a cautionary tale about women entering the workforce. If a woman enters the workforce, bad things are going to happen at home. Their children are going to die. So basically, it was a very insidious way to tell women to stay at home and take care of the babies. And that's a very popular trope. Babies, like, did you check the children, the babysitter trope? And sometimes the babysitter fights back and wins, of course, right? But when you realize the ulterior messaging that went in to start this story, it's shocking. A lot of these stories are actually cautionary tales against things, against Jersey Devil. It's about being pagan in a lot of ways. If you're not part of the church, you're the devil and you live in the woods. Don't go in the woods. Wendigo. Wendigo is basically about the white man's insatiable thirst for Native American resources. There's all these tropes, these stories that come up. Some of them good, have a positive message. Some of them have a very negative message.
In all the cases that you've investigated, what's been like a common thread in terms of urban legend, how urban legends originate?
On the crime side, it's all social justice. Who's watching the detectives? Long Island or even Cropsey. I was just amazed in my hometown that the legal system, you could bring all these people on the stand and they could basically make allegations that you didn't have to technically prove. They just make these allegations. So people could get on the stand and say whatever they want about me without that being proven. I was like, okay. So part of it is social justice, and the part of it is the kind of urban legend side of it, the thematic urban legend side. It's the nugget of truth behind the urban legend and how that nugget of truth gets co-opted by the storyteller and for what reason.
That reminds me quite a bit about of how some of these satanic panic cases kind of spiraled out of control when you have people just on the witness stand making allegations and some of them are so far-fetched and not true. McMartin preschool case and some of the other cases out there.
I go back and forth. There's a professor, I've gone so far down the rabbit hole. There's a professor who was like, look, there was probably some kernel of impropriety going on, some kernel, but most of the cases, it was obviously lies, fabrications. And the question is why? Why did this spread so much? And obviously it was the media. We can thank Geraldo. But, there was a real concerted effort in the 1980s via the moral majority to undermine, again, women in the workforce. And they were very fearful post-1970s sexual revolution, divorce rates, things like that, abortion, obviously. They were very fearful of the destruction of the nuclear family on a religious side. And, it was so insidious that the idea, and you wonder, like, are there a whole bunch of guys, white old guys sitting in the back of a room, being like, okay, we're going to target, we're going to go, let's go for the kindergartens. But it was so insidious because they were like, let's start with, well, we know fear works better than fear's the best. And then they're like, let's start with the first line of defense after the baby leaves the home, the kindergarten, and it just became crazy. And it was wildfire. And people should obviously see, the direct connections between the satanic panic of the 1980s and the Save the Children movement of today. How are there not red lights flashing all over the place? But also, how are those people not like, oh, wait, we made the same mistake 30 years ago? Like, not getting it. Same people, same religious organizations, same type of messaging, same using the messaging as a cover for political gain, but getting normal people in hysterics.
And it's interesting that you mentioned about the nuclear family, because when it comes to like childhood sexual abuse, a lot of the perpetrators are someone that the child knows within the family or family friends.
Of course, it was ridiculous. Basically, in my mind, the satanic panic movement basically probably stretched out abuse for children by an additional decade to 20 years. Because I'm sure the priests were like, oh, yeah, it's not us. It's the kindergarten teachers. And, they were allowed to molest freely for an additional 20 years. It's like, guys, look at the numbers. So basically, it was a kind of look over there type of thing. But, was it political? And I'm sure there were willing people who kind of went along with it. Of course, those who screamed the loudest. And unfortunately, I think it really pulled away the attention that was starting to move onto the Catholic Church, because that happened almost 15 years later. It took that long. But I think people were kind of like looking around. So it diverted the attention away, for sure.
I mean, you made the switch from fiction to documentaries, so why did you do that? And also, how is the filmmaking process for each type?
Documentaries are cooler. You know what it is? I like narrative. It's beautiful. It's lovely. Actors are fun. At the same time, they're very difficult. Just like agents and stuff like that is not always the fun part of it, but it is a great process. Documentary filmmaking was a way for me to kind of just make films without needing millions of dollars up front to pay for this and to pay for that. It was a way that I could do it. And, it is filmmaking without a net. There is no script. You are creating it. It's a really big puzzle piece, like a game of Jenga. And for me, it's a lot scarier, and you really have to figure it out. To me, it's like filmmaking without a net. Don't know. Some people, the idea of embarking on a story and not knowing where it ends, that's nuts. And it costing $1 million, that's a gamble. So that's fun.
I mean, obviously, like you said, when you're doing a documentary, it can lead you down so many different paths, and you kind of just follow the story. So especially from watching, let's say, like the killing season, where you're kind of traveling across the country, were there moments where you were actually ever kind of scared during your investigations of these cases? And how did you keep yourself safe if you ever had to?
Yeah, I mean, we're out in the middle of in Atlantic City at 3:00 in the morning, asking pimps if we could speak to their quote unquote girls, I guess. We were asking pimps, like, hey, do you mind if we talk to these people? Or just asking, women on the street, and their pimps were like, who the fuck? So it gets pretty hairy going to the outlaw motorcycle group, who basically they don't really care about going to prison that much, I guess. So there were some dangerous situations. Sometimes we had security and sometimes we didn't. Definitely taking a risk. I wouldn't call myself an adrenaline junkie, but that risk there's just something about capturing those moments on film, the nervousness that I just find very raw and real. I'm manipulating myself. So it's not like I'm manipulating some actor and, making them stay up till like 2:00 in the morning and doing all this stuff. Like, I'm manipulating myself. So that was how I was able to justify that. And yeah, I was totally freaked out so many times.
As filmmakers, Rachel and I have covered serial murder for more than a decade. And now we're here to document one of the most baffling cases of our time, that of the Long Island serial killer, aka Lisk. Were you here
making the killing season or what have you? It's just, you just don't know what's going to happen. And it used to be a little easier. Now, just the camera itself, people seeing the camera, people being anti-press, from politicians calling press the enemy of the state. Are you fucking kidding me? What are you talking about? That's just people who don't want to watchdog around because they're doing bad things. But we all know that. But people have really, I think in some ways, viewed the press now, or view cameras or view documentaries not in the best light. So that's changed quite a bit. It's become much more dangerous than it used to be.
I mean, you got these people to talk. Like, you got people that I feel like would be kind of difficult to to have a conversation with about these cases and these situations. How are you able to do that?
Research. The only way these people are going to engage you is if you actually know something. And if you're empathetic to their story, genuinely empathetic to their story and care, but also like in the know. You and I both know what it's like to be out here 3 o'clock in the morning. You do because you've been out here for the past 6 months, and I do because I've been out here for the past 2 weeks and you've seen me walking around. Let's tell other people how fucking crazy this is, and then they'll open up, but they're not going to open up immediately. You have to prove that you've walked the walk. People wouldn't open up to us, for 3 days. When we did Murder Mountain up in the hills of Humboldt County, we were there for 6 months before the weed dealers or the weed farmers would even talk to us. After 6 months, they were like, okay, you're in. But it took 6 months, and that was a long time. That was a process, and people had to calm me down. They're like, look, this is filmmaking. My other filmmaking partners, they're like, look, this is just what it's going to take. So settle down. You're not going to get the goods every day. You're not going to shoot amazing interviews every day. This is part of the work to get to the next step. And then I was like, oh, I see. Interesting. I was like, so we probably won't even use anything from this week. And they're like, no. I was like, that's fascinating. You learn to basically, you're not shooting for today, you're shooting for tomorrow. It's a long game.
Slow burn.
Yeah, long game, slow burn. So I would say for me, a lot of it was research, knowing just as much as the other press, for sure, having information that the police, were like, oh, you know your stuff. And they'll open up. It's that level of respect. So a lot of it was research. That's why it's so hard for me to listen to all these podcasts who do a different story every week. And it's like, okay, you're telling me about a crime I may not know. That's valid. I don't just want to know about a crime. Like, I want to know details. And how am I supposed to trust your details or your perspective if you're doing it week to week and this is like 3 hours, 4 hours research? Like, if you're going to do the research, you need to do like months of research. Like, I do 6 months of research. That's why I do years of research. That's why it takes me so long to make these projects. So I don't know, you can tell when it's their life, they have become the expert on that. There was a while in the Gilgo Beach case when I was the guy. There was me, maybe a lawyer out there, and the police. And that was it. When everybody starts to bring their hot takes, it's really hard to catch up. And now I'm like, okay, I'm pass the mantle on to somebody else. But that's what you have to be, that person. As a documentarian, you have to be a citizen detective. You have to know as much about that story than anybody else out there.
Yeah, but also I think if you were sitting next to me on a flight and you asked me to tell me my deepest, darkest secrets, I probably would, because there's just something about you.
She's saying that because she does that to people herself.
Right, exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, there's also something very interesting about the randomness of that whole, like, we're having this conversation for a purpose. I am the expert on this. You are the expert on that. And we're just going to talk for 15 minutes and then really start to go down the rabbit hole and then be like, okay, well, do you know this? Okay, do you know this? Back and forth and back and forth. But then there is the random part of that whole thing, the chance encounter and the chance nature, which is another trope of our storytelling world. I had no idea. I was sitting next to this person and they turned to me and said this. And I was like, you're kidding me. My mother, blah, blah, blah. And then, that leads to said revelation of I am your half sister. There's something like kind of cool and interesting about the randomness of that allows it to have its own value, creepiness, if you will.
So let's say you could go back in time. What's a case or legend that you would want to investigate as a person in that time?
That's a truly tough one. There's so many. Like, if back in time?
Yeah, it could be unsolved. It could be solved, but maybe unsolved at that time.
Black Dahlia at this moment in time. That's one I'd really like to do. There's a lot of stories that I really enjoy, but then it's like, is that too old to tell to an audience? How are you going to tell it? Is there any archive footage? Like, as a filmmaker versus a writer of a book, as a filmmaker, you can't get too old because it just becomes very difficult to do so. Also, the streamers, networks, what have you, they're like, oh, no, we got to speak to today. The kids of today. The kids today want Fire Festival versus Lizzie Borden. Okay, maybe. That's your opinion, not my opinion. For some reason, anything old is...
That's weird.
Younger generations don't want anything old. So we do run into that problem in terms of telling a lot of older stories because there's been so many good ones. People are like, no, it's too old.
But Jack the Ripper seems to have, like, still, even now, piques people's interest for some reason.
Sure. Well, Jack the Ripper's this was an interesting thing for me making The Killing Season about Long Island, Gilgo Beach. And I was surprised more people didn't go there. Like more people I didn't see more headlines like modern day Jack the Ripper. I was expecting to see that, but they didn't do that. And I was expecting, this was something like I didn't do in the series, but start in the Jack the Ripper and end in Gilgo, or start in Gilgo, go to Jack the Ripper and come back. I would have thought people would have been more on that tip. This is such a reoccurring thing. This serial murder, sex workers, back alleys, this back and forth, and this story that just doesn't end. And of course, logically, we understand sex workers make themselves available. They're open, quote unquote, in the middle of the night. They make the quote unquote, this is victim blaming, but they make the perfect victim, those types of tropes. I would have thought people glommed onto that more, but they didn't. They really didn't go for like the kind of connection. Although I still did it in the show, we had a valid reason to do it because there were some of the killings where torsos were found, right? And so you get into the whole torso idea. And the idea was Jack the Ripper, were there two killers? Basically is some of the idea. Were there two killers? Did Jack the Ripper really write the letter to the press, or was it a member of the press? There's so many interesting parallels to today. They basically don't know whether Jack the Ripper really wrote that letter. Somebody's like, oh, it was just some editor who wrote the letter to himself in like the first case. It's like, oh, that's so smart. Devious, but smart. And so there were so many interesting parallels, whether it was the two killers or one, or contacting the press, or that whole storyline. So yeah, Jack the Ripper, proto right there. So you would want to do Jack the Ripper?
If I went back in time?
Yeah.
No, actually, I would want to Eileen Wuornos.
Eileen Wuornos.
She was the opposite, right? Sex worker turned, because she was
very much the opposite. Very much the opposite. So when I started out making docs, there were basically two filmmakers who kind of influenced me. One was Joe Berlinger with Brothers Keeper and Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost, for me, it was the combination of Metallica and that story that really hit both like the entertainment side of it and the creep side of it for me with the Satanic Panic. I mean, that movie had everything. The Metallica, the Satanic Panic, and the kind of mystery of who killed these kids, and the whole social justice. Like it was like the four things right off the bat. And obviously, you haven't seen it, for those who haven't, My Brother's Keeper. But the other side was Nick Broomfield and Eileen Wuornos. Like that was really influential because it wasn't just the crime, but all the craziness that goes on around the crime, from parents adopting and wanting to turn her into some kind of religious nut, or their own mental illness coming through, or the social justice. So if you look at like The Killing Season, it's not just the crime, but it's a lot of it is the kind of periphery around the crime and that craziness. And so in a very Nick Broomfield way, knocking on knocking on somebody's door and like walking inside and being like, would you mind telling us, Nick Broomfield's British, right? So he managed to get it because he's like, oh, hello. People always just innately want to talk to British people for some reason. I mean, I get it. So that's another thing that we try to do. So that's definitely another very strong influence. So Eileen Wuornos' Portrait of a Serial Killer was a very, very big influence. I started Cropsey pre-internet. Not like the internet was there, but like not in the same way. And so it was really amazing. It was a different world where like I had a sheet of paper with 12 names on them. And the only way you could get in touch was to knock on the door. It was a lot more acceptable to knock on the door. Like, and that's one big thing that's changed in the past 20 years is like, you might get shot. It's totally true, of course. But, knocking on doors, that's how we did. We drive around in a car with a sheet of paper and knock on 10 doors. Now, the thing is, as a filmmaker, that's actually helpful because you never know what you're going to find. It's a lot more interesting. Sometimes we would go knock on a door because you had a name and somebody would see you knock on a door. There would be a camera or like four people, like milling about. And obviously that piques somebody's interest in the neighborhood, like the neighborhood bully, the neighborhood watcher, whoever it is in the neighborhood, right? And they'd be like, what's going on over there? Well, we're looking for the person who blank this murder. And they'll be like, well, I'll tell you about it. Like that's how you get the story. It's not necessarily the person you were going to see. It's just the person who's going to talk who happens to want to talk, and they see with a camera, and then their interest is piqued, So a lot of times it was, we were going to look for the father. The father was too old to tell us something. So like we're making Cropsey, right? And so we're going to look for the parents of a whole bunch of children who were taken on a bus by Andre Rand to New Jersey to watch the planes take off. Like he basically kidnapped a whole group of kids and took them to a White Castle and took them to watch the planes take off in New York airport. We had the name of the dad and, go knock on the door, and the dad wouldn't even, he's like, I don't know, figuring out whether he's going to talk to us. But then the son is like, wait a second, you guys are asking about Andre Rand? I was like, yeah, the son lived next door. And so he started to talk to us. So it's always that thing. If you give people time to think about it, doing an interview, they're not going to do it. But if you get them in that moment, they will say yes. Sometimes they will say yes. Don't plan on days. When we were making Murder Mountain, it's basically, they were good people, but ultimately at the end of the day, somewhat dysfunctional people growing weed up in the middle of Humboldt County with very little phones and somewhat dysfunctional family life. You couldn't set a time to go meet these people. They would never show up. You had to just go find them.
We've experimented a little bit with trying to go out and just talk to people on the street and interview them. And I think we were surprised that people talked as much as they did.
There is just something really interesting about it. Like, you understand the thrill of it from a journalistic side, but you also understand the thrill of social engineering, right? Trying to get people to talk to you. And then there's the thrill of like, you don't know what you're going to find. And then the other thrill of like, you went to go talk to somebody about something, and then they told you a totally different story that led you down on a different path that you had no idea connected to that. And so in some ways, like, if you're not doing that in an investigation, you're not investigating. You're not truly investigating. You can't just arrange to call people on the phone to have these conversations over and over. It takes a hell of a lot longer, but that's true investigating. That's like cops, right? They knock on, go around the neighborhood knocking on doors. That's where you learn. So there seemed to be a little bit of a lost art to that. And that's why maybe some of our storytelling seems a little stilted in some respects. Collective storytelling, not my storytelling.
What case or legend still keeps you up at night? Like what still bothers you?
There's so many. I don't think any network streamer will ever let me do it. But for me, it's Walking Sam. So Walking Sam is in the Lakota Indian tribe. There were a bunch of suicides, many teenage suicides a couple of years ago. And a lot of the kids attributed it to a kind of Slender Man type character. Tall, black coat. This is, again, a typical proto tall black coat, long arm character boogeyman that many people see. Slender Man is one, Stove Hat or somebody guy, like the same character is seen in numerous different cultures and something like that. And so Lakota Indians call him Walking Sam, and he's basically a negative energy ancient one. And for kids who are in despair, Walking Sam basically convinces you to commit suicide. And so there were a bunch of mass suicides a couple years ago, and the kids attributed to Walking Sam telling them to do it. And basically what you have is just unbelievable amount of despair, societal ills. It's truly horrific what has been done, generationally to the American Indian in that area in terms of the amounts of alcoholism, the lack of resources and everything. And so you've got two contagions connecting at the same time. The one contagion, it's like the white van contagion. Everybody thinks that they see this evil, this devil thing, whether it's, the man in the hat or the white or the clowns. Same thing, right? Phantom clown scares. It's a contagion. Everybody thinks that they see it, and that makes more people see it, whether they know it or not, whether they're subconsciously, consciously. And the same thing happens with suicide, teen suicide. It's contagion. We know that teen suicide happens in sometimes clusters. It's contagion as well. So you have two different contagions feeding on top of each other, which almost doubles the effect. And so, it's like the realness of an urban legend supersized because of what that does. And when you look at a very interesting teen suicide, again, it's the same contagion. It's the same methodology of which to get there. So So that truly keeps me up at night, because that's almost the worst case scenario of urban legend being true. It's not necessarily true until you make it true. And the suicide makes it true.
Yeah, I mean, the teens are dying. That's a fact.
Oh, absolutely. They're dying teen suicide or suicide, right? When there are huge amounts of depression and hopelessness, you can understand it in some respects. You can understand that when you're younger, it may be just quicker, right, to find that way out. But when you then throw in the boogeyman convincing you to do it, then it becomes wicked insidious.
Yeah, I can see how that might push them to do it even more once they see this figure.
Because basically it's an allowance. It's an allowance that says it's okay. It's also like, there's like, oh, the monster visited me, I'm special. Right. There's some part of that, the desire for connection in the face of such depression. You want to be part of the group, right? That's the suicide cluster idea of it. So yeah. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. It was great talking to you.
Great talking to you as well.
We'd like to thank Josh for joining us today, inspiring and educating us on some of the darkest corners and mysteries of human nature. If you haven't already, make sure to check out Josh's documentaries like Cropsey, The Killing Season, Murder Mountain, and Killer Legends.
You can find Cropsey and Killer Legends streaming on Amazon Prime Video, Tubi, and Plex. You can find The Killing Season on Hulu and Amazon Prime Video, and you can find Murder Mountain on Netflix. I'm sure you're all wondering what Josh's latest project is, and you're in luck. I'm just about to tell you. Josh's latest film, Checkpoint Zoo, will be premiering at the Tribeca Film Festival this week. That's right. I said this week. It's a documentary that centers on an animal refuge in Ukraine's second largest city during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Almost 5,000 animals were trapped during the early stages of the war. And in the midst of this sudden war, a small group of fearless zookeepers and volunteers work to rescue and evacuate the beloved animals to a safe space. It premieres on June 6th, so go get your tickets today. We'll have a link in the show notes. Don't forget to check out the show notes for Josh's episode on our website. That's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. You can find us on Instagram, X, Threads, and TikTok, and you can find us anywhere that you get your podcasts. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.